So hello, this is a video on the revised meat module, and it incorporates some feedback that we've had following the release of the revised meat module from breeders and bureaus who were using it, and it includes processor information, carcass information that has come available since then. So just to give you some background, the reason that this work was undertaken is that the genetic parameters that we use or have used in the cell meat module since it began go back largely to one experiment back in 1992, and the animals that were in that experiment were Romney and Romney cross animals. They had a 14.6 kilogram carcass weight and an average of around about 7 millimeters GR, and so these animals are very different to the animals that we have now. So if we look at the industry today, we've got a far greater diversity in the breeds that we have running and the crosses that are associated with that. Our carcasses are substantially heavier than that 14.6 kilograms, and they actually have less fat at a higher carcass weight. And there are also a significantly greater range of live animal and carcass technologies that give us meat yield data that's now available for use for breeders. And if we just have a look at, it was 30 years, what's the change that we've got in carcass characteristics between 2018, 2019 and 1988, when basically the research was last done. So if we have a look at our carcasses are now currently, our average is around about 18.5 kilos. That brings us around about 11.1 kilograms of saleable meat that can be recovered from that carcass, and our eye muscle area, traced here in red, is about 14 square centimetres. If we look back to what the animals were like in 1988, 14.6 kilogram carcass, as we said, so it's only 80% of what we're producing now. Big changes in both of our eye muscle area, 9.1 centimetres, or only 65% of what we're doing now, and lean yield, only producing about 7.1 kilograms of meat, or 70% of what we're doing now. In addition to that, there is fat on the carcass, and if we have a look, in 1988 we were producing 3.1 kilograms of fat on the carcass. Now there is only 2.5 kilograms on a carcass that is about 25% bigger. So there's been a massive change in the amount of fat that is now in our carcass, a lot less than we had in those days. So bigger carcass, more meat, and less fat is the summary. So our animals are very different to what they were. So why did we revise, what did we do in order to revise the module? Well, we undertook 4 years of research basically to recalibrate the meat module for that current range of carcass weight and yields, the fact that our breeds and strains are very different, and to incorporate those measurement technologies that are now available. And that resulted in differences in the genetic parameters that we had underlying our genetic evaluations. And it meant that there were some changes that occurred in the rankings because we had better information and more accurate breeding values. So this was done, and it was basically released at the end of September for use in October, but it was run in parallel with the old system so that breeders could have a look at the changes that were coming, because there were some reasonably large changes for some rams, and to give them several months to use it and just get used to the new values. So what were the changes that we actually saw in the revised meat module? So the primary effect that we saw was that it greatly improved the carcass weight breeding value, which was a little bit of a surprise because carcass weight isn't actually a trait that we were referring to as a meat trait. So under the old system that had operated for a good 20 years in SIL, carcass weight breeding value came out of the growth module, and it was only estimated using live weight data. So if there was any ultrasound scanning, any CT scanning, any VIA scan, none of that information went into the old carcass weight breeding value. Under the revised meat module, the new carcass weight breeding value had all that meat information that came out of all those systems. It still used live weights, but any carcass data that was there, it went into predicting our carcass weight BV, which was a major change for the better, but still a major change for our system. So there were secondary effects that had improved the accuracy of our breeding values for meat and fat traits because they had changed, and those are the shoulder, loin and hindquarter lean yield and also our fat BV. But the main change was that there was a relatively substantial change in the carcass weight breeding value. So if we actually just have a look at what it looks like, and this here is comparing under our old system before we did the revision to the meat module, and here we've got our live weight 8 breeding value from our old growth module and the carcass weight breeding value. And what you can see here is that we've got basically a one-to-one relationship. That carcass weight was predicted entirely from live weight data, and so any differences in dressing percent were not picked up under that system. Under our new system, here is our old carcass weight breeding value and the carcass weight that we released in October. And so what you see here is that the relationship is still the same between them, but we've got big movement for some of these rams. And so what we've got is some animals for the live weight that they had, we've actually got a higher carcass weight, and other animals for the live weight that they had, they've got a lower carcass weight than we expected. And so basically these are differences in dressing out percentage. Either animals were above or below the average that we were unable to detect under our old system and were reported through an increase in lean yield. So that created for us a reporting issue, and the reason for this is that there's now in our dual purpose growth and our terminal sire growth indexes, it substantially changed the carcass weight breeding value because carcass weight is accounted for in our growth sub-index. So we've got meat data that is now crossed out of the meat module and into the growth module. So the differences that we saw in the meat module, because all of the differences had in carcass weight yield had been moved out, it meant that our yield breeding values, so our shoulder, our loin and our hindquarter lean yield, they were substantially reduced, and so there was very little variation in meat. So you couldn't see any differences there. It all disappeared and gone across into the growth module. And so we had an increase in value in the dual purpose growth and a decrease in the dual purpose meat, and we saw exactly the same effects in the terminal sire indexes. And so what it's done is it created a problem for us, and it changed the balance between the growth and meat sub-indexes, and it meant if someone was actually trying to select meaty animals, a lot of the information that they were using to do that had gone across and was now being reported in the growth module, so it wasn't very helpful for people who were really trying to put a focus on meat. So we had to come up with a way to deal with this. And so the way that we did this is that we've just done some work over the last few months, and what we've done is we've divided growth up into, we've divided carcass weight up into growth and meat components. And so what we've done is that we've generated a carcass weight BV, which is basically the growth component of it, and that is reported in the growth index, and it mainly reflects the live weight information just in the same way that it always did in the 20 years that we've been using SIL prior to this. And then what we came up with was a new BV called carcass weight yield BV, and it's the change in carcass weight due to meat data, and it's accounted for in the meat subindex. So an animal that dresses higher and produces more weight than we would expect at a given live weight, that component is measured and that's reported in the meat subindex. And likewise, if it has a smaller carcass than expected for its live weight, that's a meat trait that's reported in the meat subindex. And so for most animals, this is an increase in overall value, but for some animals there is a decrease, and that's because they actually dress out lower than expected for their size due to their live weight. So if we just have a look at a couple of rams to have a look at how this actually works out. So what we've got is carcass merit. When we look at the total across both our growth and meat indexes, the total works out the same, but where it's accounted for differs. So we've got 5 rams here that we're not going to identify, but they've got differences in their carcass weight BV, and this is This is the carcass weight BV that was released in October. And so what we see here is we've got a ram with a lower value at 0.39, one with a high value at 4.11, and some in the middle at around about 2 kilograms. And so that's what people have been seeing as their carcass weight BV since October. We've now split that into two components. So we've got the growth component here, carcass weight BV, and reported in the growth subindex, and our carcass weight yield BV reported in the meat. And so we've split it apart, and so the bit that is just due to how fast they grow, their live weights, it's dropped from 1.98 to 1.49, and we've got half a kilogram over here. And if we sum those together, we come up with almost exactly the same number, just a slight change due to rounding errors. So when we add those two together, we come up with the same amount, but we've divided it across our two modules. Same story here. So we can see as we work down that our very large our animal with our highest carcass weight BV is very high for growth, and it's the highest one for yield. Our intermediates are intermediate here for growth, but there's some differences here. This one here has the highest dressing percent, the highest yield of meat for a given live weight. This one here has a lower one, so there's variation in how quickly they've grown and how much meat they've put on between these animals. And our animal with a low carcass weight BV here is low on our carcass weight in the growth module and also low on yield. But you can see nicely here that the overall result hasn't changed. What's changed is where we report the meat that turns up between those two. And so it's just sticking with dual purpose. If we look at our maternal worth plus meat, that's built up, but breeders will be familiar with this, but it's that our maternal worth is built up out of reproduction, survival, growth, adult size and wool, and then we've added to that meat over here. And if we look at the index that's built up, our growth index is built up, as it always has been, out of weaning weight and carcass weight BV, and these economic weights haven't changed. But this now is just the carcass weight, the growth component of it. We've split that apart, and in our dual purpose meat, which breeders will have been used to it being shoulder lean, lean, loin lean and hindquarter lean, we've now added our yield component of carcass weight in here. It has the same economic value, but it's added the overall meatiness in, and then the yield difference is there. So that's the big change that's happened. We've split it here. So it does not change the overall value that we saw in maternal worth plus meat, but it has split them apart in the two, across the two sub-indexes. Now, for breeders that have been looking at their results since October, this will change the New Zealand maternal worth for flocks that had meat information, because that meat component is not now included. This part here, which was sitting in here, has been transferred out, so they'll see that disappear. This is just reverting it back to the way that it was before we did the revision, albeit with the new genetic parameters that we're using. So if you're just looking at New Zealand maternal worth, it will change again from the change that you saw in October, but now it reflects the growth component, and the meat component is reported in the meat subindex. So if we just have a look at how that actually impacts on reporting, I've got two graphs here. What we've got here is the maternal worth and meat values that we've seen since October, and now our revised reporting. And when we add them together, you'll see that the correlation is extremely high. So in overall merit, there is no change. But if we have a look at the maternal worth, here's the change. This is the maternal worth that we've seen since October. Because we've pulled the carcass component out, if we're just looking at maternal worth, here's the difference that we're now taking out and putting into the meat module. So you will see a difference. It's reverting it back to expressing it on the same basis as it was prior to October, which means that growth is reported fairly in the growth module and meat is reported fairly in the meat module. And so the changes in flocks is because the meat data is excluded from the carcass weight in the dual purpose growth index. So let's just have a look at some example sires. Once again, some rams that have been anonymised, and if we have a look between the two systems. The examples are basically exactly the same, although we've got 1 cent difference because of rounding errors. Our dual purpose growth index has changed. So for this ram here, 370 cents has disappeared out of growth because it shouldn't have been put in there. In this one here, 366 cents has disappeared out of growth because it shouldn't have been there. And our lower ram, 94 cents, has disappeared, but it's all turned up in meat. And so you can see our 370 cents has gone from growth and it's turned up back in meat where it should have been, where it belongs. And so there are some differences there. The rounding is all within 1 cent for the rams that we've looked at. So overall indexes are exactly the same, but we've got a redistribution putting the meat back where it belongs and the meat modulin taking that out of the growth and giving a better way for breeders to be able to see how meaty or how growthy their rams are. So the key message is that the balance between the appropriate balance between growth and meat has now been restored by moving that meat component of carcass weight to a new breeding value that we're calling carcass weight yield, CWYBV, and that's reported in the meat sub-index, and that's in both the dual purpose and the terminal sire meat indexes. So it doesn't change the overall merit of terminal sires or in maternal worth when you look at maternal worth plus meat, but it will change the new New Zealand maternal worth that we've had for several months because we're removing that meat information that came in wrongly from carcass weight. And so, so dual purpose breeders will see it if they've got any carcass information. Now, the other thing that we've done is that we've included, in the last couple of months, is that we've included more processor data, making breeders able to get additional information and add it and improve their breeding values. So most of this data is coming in through progeny test flocks that are being run around the country. And so we've been collecting Viascan data since the original central progeny test started back in 2002, but that's been available for use and fed into breeding values in around about 2006. But there are more systems that are out there now, so other people are killing through different processes, and so there are a range of systems. There is just having carcass weight data, using carcass weight in addition to carcass GR and a butt circumference, a measurement around the rump of the animal, and also Progressive Meat Limited has a system where they actually weigh cuts. Information from that, we've now added that, so that's able to be used in genetic evaluation. So that's all new, and that's in final stages of testing and will be released soon. So we're looking at that data. These ones here, they've been calibrated against a very accurate standard, which is that we've used spiral CT, 3D pictures of the carcass, and although there are some subtle differences in accuracy between this, we weight them accordingly because from this calibration we know how accurate they are, and we're able to account for those small differences in the estimation of the breeding values. So there are 3 systems that we've got in at the moment, but at some stage in the future there may be new systems and they may be more accurate. So the way that we've built this means that we can add processor systems so long as they can be calibrated against our standard, which is our 3D carcass spiral CT scanning. So we've future-proofed this so that any new systems, they can be bought in accordingly, so we don't have to go through and wait another 10 years for another technology to come in that's been added. So a little bit of work to calibrate it, but they can be added and add benefit to the breeders as they go. So our expectations are that we had when we're adding this is that sires that had processor data would be expected to have better breeding values. So we would expect their breeding values to change. And so this is what we looked for when we started testing. Sires without processor data for progeny, we would expect a different result. If they had some animals that were related to other sires that had processor data, we would expect to see some change, but if they didn't have any relationships to animals that had no data, then we would expect very little or no change. So animals that were sires of progeny, big, reasonably large changes, some changes if they were related. If they were unrelated, we wouldn't expect to see much changes over what we've got. So we investigated that. And just a couple of graphs here just to show you. We've got 3 colours here. Our pink animals are animals that have no carcass, no progeny with carcass data, so these are sire breeding values. And what we've got here is if we have our carcass weight breeding value without meat processor data and our carcass weight BV with processor data. Our animals that we've got no data on, they all sit very close to a line. There's just a little bit of movement across. Animals that have up to 10 progeny with carcasses are the blue dots. There's not many of those, but we've got them in here. And then we've got animals, our green dots, that have more than 10 progeny, and some of them have very large numbers, some of them have up to 300 progeny. So although there's not many blue dots, they're sort of sitting in and around that line, so a little bit of change, large change for animals that have a lot of progeny. So these are animals that the accuracy of the breeding value improves. Some animals have moved up, some animals have moved down. Greater changes for animals that have more progeny than less progeny. We've got some changes, a small amount of change in our animals that have no slaughter progeny, and that's because these are connected, they're related to some of these rams, so some of the differences, they're still getting the benefit from these other rams that have done, so a little bit of change there. So some movement in close relatives. And if we have a look at our terminal sire meat, without processor data and with processor data, a very similar story. Our colours are the same. Our pink represent animals with no progeny, blue a small number of progeny, and green a large number of progeny. We see a bit more variation because there are we've got carcass weight and yield, so there's a bit more variation to pick up. And so we see a greater movement, but once again, sires with large numbers of progeny move up or down depending on whether they genuinely are better or worse. Sires with a small number of progeny do the same, but not by as much. And animals with a small number of progeny have moved a bit because they do have some connections that drive that. So it's behaving in the way that we would expect, and so that gives us confidence that it's doing a good job, and this is going to be a very useful thing to add for breeders so that they can use whichever meat processor grading system is closest to them, or which that they normally use, and they're able to get that information to inform their breeding values. So now in summary across both of these, going back to the carcass weight BV, the carcass weight BV now in the growth module now predominantly reflects live weights. It's calculated in the meat module, so it's still informed by some of that meat data, but it is predominantly based on the live weight data. Our new carcass weight yield BV, CWY-BV, is informed by both meat and growth data, and so it's the difference, it's the meatiness over and above what we would expect based on live weight alone. And where there is actual carcass weight data or other processor measures, that is now included, and that's one of the biggest changes. Previously, we didn't use any of that data in the carcass weight. Now, any data that's in there is included in informing and giving us a more accurate breeding value. And the revision that we've made since October is that we've restored the correct balance between meat and growth. So, given a fair balance between, if you want to select a growthy ram, an animal that grows well, an animal that's very meaty, or a balance between the two. So those are being fairly reported between those two modules. And overall, we're getting more accurate estimates of the merit for meat because there is a lot more data that's going into informing that. Just some information on when this is going to be released, and so these developments are going to go live in the single step run from the 1st of February this year. So that includes both our revised meat yield reporting that we talked about in the first part, and the inclusion of all of the processor information whenever it's available, wherever it's available. Ram Finder is going to be updated with those values in February as well. So if you use Ram Finder, that's going to be informed by the completely revised system. The last NZGE run with the old meat module is going to be available and kept online for some time, just for comparison purposes. But if you are looking at that, just bear in mind that it's going to be immediately out of date as soon as breeders add any of their autumn measurements, which are coming very quickly. So it's there for reference, but breeders should be using the new values that are coming out of these revised runs. Thank you very much.